Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, SEL and STEM, Building Empathy to Help Solve Real-World Problems. My name is Amanda Rothengast, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we introduce our speaker, I would like to let you know a bit more about our webinars. Both Sanford Inspire and Sanford Harmony host these webinars, where thought leaders and educators can share best teaching practices and tools to support social-emotional learning. These presentations are the opinions and content of our guest speakers and may not necessarily be a direct representation of Sanford Harmony or Sanford Inspire. For best viewing of this webinar, it is recommended that you shut down all other browsers. Also, if you have questions for our speaker, feel free to use your question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a copy of the slide deck and recording within the next week. And if you're watching this webinar live, you will receive a copy of a certificate of completion from GoToWebinar within 48 hours. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. Michael Soskil, the 2017-18 Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year, is editor of Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy, and co-author of Teaching in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. In 2016, Dr. Stephen Hawking announced him as one of the top 10 teachers in the world and a finalist for the Global Teacher Prize. In addition to advocating for teacher agency and democratic system, he helps students take action for social good as an elementary STEM teacher. Please join me in welcoming Michael Soskil.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Amanda. So let's jump in, and before we start, let me just reiterate what Amanda said before, that please use the question and answer box throughout the webinar. If there is anything that you want to know, if you want to stop me and have Amanda interrupt me to ask a question, that's great. I know you're giving up part of your Tuesday during the summer to learn and to get better for your students, so I want you to get as much out of this as you possibly can. So feel free to use that chat box and share some ideas. We're going to make part of this interactive, so I'm going to ask you to do that, but don't hesitate to ask a question if you've got one. So before we start, let's lay the foundation. I want you to think about this question. Why is it that you chose to teach? So often we dive into the what we can do in education and the how we can do it, but we don't think about the why we're doing it. And until we get our purpose right, until we get the purpose of education right and our own individual purposes, we're not going to be able to get things right for children. So answer this question for yourself internally. Why is it that you teach? So as you're thinking about that, I'm going to share my why. I'm going to share how I found my passion, my teaching passion. Of course, when I chose to become a teacher, I did it for all of the reasons that most of us did. I loved working with kids. I had been a youth soccer coach even during my college years and even during high school. I loved working with kids. I wanted them to get better and to see their potential. I wanted to shape the future. But it wasn't until a moment about 5 or 10 years into my teaching career that I really understood my purpose. And it all started with this Skype call that you see on your screen right here. My students were preparing for a St. Patrick's Day concert that they had. And instead of practicing their songs to an empty cafegimatorium, I worked with my music teacher and we decided we were going to do a song exchange where we would sing for kids in the Kibera slum of Nairobi, a group of kids that we had been connected with. And in exchange, we would ask them to sing to us. And so we had this amazing video conference exchange where the kids laughed together and they sang to each other, and we heard them sing friendship songs in Swahili and their national anthem, and our kids shared the songs that they were practicing. And afterwards, my students came to me and they had tears in their eyes. And they said, Mr. Soskil, those kids were amazing. We saw how happy they were. We loved connecting with them, but their school doesn't look the same as ours. We see the conditions of that school, and our school is beautiful and theirs isn't, and that's not right. We should do something to help them. And in that moment, I made a decision. I'm not exactly sure where it came from. It was kind of serendipitous, but I told my students, of course, we can do something to help them, but I want you to ask for something in return. I want you to try and find value in the kids that you're trying to help so that we can see each other as equals. And after a couple days of thinking about it, my students came up with this amazing project. They decided that they would use math materials, manipulatives, that we had in our school that weren't available in the Kibera slum, to teach math conceptually to the kids in Kibera through video. So every week, my fifth graders would record a video of something I had taught them using math manipulatives. They would take that lesson and teach it to the kids in Kenya. And in exchange, the children in Kibera at the Chiri Children Education Center would record a video for us each week teaching us how to speak Swahili, the days of the week, how to count to 10, months of the year, etc. And we would play that for the entire school, K through 5, on in our morning news broadcast. And through that, relationships were built. But a couple of months in, we had a call with the school director where he took us out and he showed us the infrastructure of the pipes around the school. And my kids learned that lack of school supplies were not the biggest challenge that was facing the kids there in Kibera. The pipes that led water into the school were garden hoses and PVC pipe that was duct taped together in some instances, and it ran along the ground. And during the rainy season, the pit toilets in the slum would overflow and they would contaminate the water supply and kids would get sick. And again, my students said, those are our friends. We need to do something to help them. And so they partnered with kids in Kansas and kids in Greece to raise money for water filters. You can see in the picture here a big blue water filter. Together between the three different areas, between the three schools, we're able to raise $12,000 for water filters, enough to protect kids in school in 2 different schools and to send water filters home with them to protect their families. And I happened to write a grant so that I was in Kenya when the water filters were passed out. And I was at the Chiri Children Education Center. And I will tell you, the most powerful moment of my teaching career came while I was standing in a dirt courtyard 7,500 miles away from my students, because we had a Skype call where the groups that raised money for the water filters got to spend time with the kids who had just received them. And the children in Kenya were hugging their water filters because I was there during the rainy season. I was there in April. And during the 2 weeks I spent in Kibera, 12 kids died of cholera. So for the children that received the filters, they knew how much they mattered. But what impacted me even more than that was seeing my own students 7,500 miles away through the computer screen. They were crying tears of joy. They were feeling the joy that comes from doing good for others and knowing that you matter. And I knew in that moment that was my purpose, to do that for my own students and to make sure that I could help other teachers do that for their students. And so that's the lens that I come to this webinar through. That's what I'm viewing, this intersection between social emotional learning and STEM. I see it through that lens, that we can allow kids to know how much they matter and to impact their local and global communities. This is an actual picture taken from the Cassini spacecraft. You probably recognize it as a picture of Saturn. It looks kind of cool, but it's a real photograph. And the reason it looks the way it does is because it's backlit. The sun is directly behind Saturn in this picture. And if you look over on the left-hand side of the rings, out past the kind of gold-colored rings, out into the blue outer ring, you can see a little blue dot. That's Earth. So often we focus on our differences, but there is so much more that we have in common than there is that drives us apart. And I really think that part of education has to be helping students find their shared humanity. That doesn't mean that they ignore the lived experiences of each other or the way that society views them and impacts them. Of course, we want to talk about those nuances. We want to look at things from different perspectives. But we also, when we see each other, when kids meet each other, we want them to know that they are human first, that there is more that connects them than divides them. And so I want you to ponder on a second question. We thought about why we individually educate, why we teach. But why do we as a society educate our children? What is the purpose of public education in our society? And again, until we get to the answer to these questions, we can't really build on top of them. So I'm going to share with you Geert Biesta. I always mispronounce his name. He is a Belgian education researcher who wrote a chapter in my book that's now in pre-order, Flip the System US. But he has this amazing model for the purpose of education in a democracy. And I love it because it really exemplifies what we're talking about. What Geert says is that there are 3 things that have to be in balance in education. Qualification, we do really well, especially in the United States. This is making sure that kids are qualified to do something after they graduate. This is our college and career readiness. We do a great job at that. What we are lacking in, and what causes some of the social emotional issues that we're going to be talking about today, is a lack of focus on the other 2 things, socialization and subjectification. socialization is preparing kids to interact with the society that educates them. So if we look at political polarization or the inability for kids to, for adults even, for society, to have nuanced conversations about places where we disagree, to grasp the complexity of issues and be able to discuss them, that's because we failed in preparing society to be able to socialize, to be able to interact with each other in that way. So education has to focus on that. But even more important is our lack of focus right now on subjectification. This is making sure that kids understand who they are, knowing what their passions are, know who they are as a self. We need our children to be holistically well. And the fact that we haven't focused on this has really led to a lot of the social, emotional, and mental health issues that we're seeing in schools. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is how do we prepare kids to impact their world? How do we help them understand the design process and how to use STEM outside of school, how to apply it outside of school, but how to do it in a way that helps them find themselves, helps them be social, emotionally well. This is more difficult than ever because we know the COVID-19 pandemic has put a lot of stress on families. It's put a lot of mental health stress on both students and teachers. And this has come in some different ways. So for students and teachers, our isolation has definitely impacted our mental health. You know this because you've gone through it. Changes in routine. We know that economic factors, teachers and students are worried about whether their families are going to be able to economically survive. And of course, there's the obvious, like people are getting sick. And so people are worried about the health of their loved ones. But for our students, we have to recognize that sometimes being quarantined and isolated in a space for a couple of months doesn't mean that space that they're in is the safest place for them. We know a lot of our children come to school because it's a safer place than home for them for a variety of reasons. That's been gone for months now. And so, you know, our children have been trying to deal with that. Motivation, that's easier for us to help with as teachers when we see students. But a lot of students, I know in Pennsylvania, it was up to 40% of kids in some districts were gone. Teachers couldn't find them. The school didn't have any contact with them. They weren't motivated to come and stay in contact with their educators. So we know that that's a problem. But also kids are just lacking purpose. If you're sitting at home and the only thing you're doing is turning in assignments because it's what you're supposed to do, but not because you're excited to do it or because it gives you any kind of intrinsic motivation, it erodes our purpose as individuals. And of course, for teachers, we've struggled with this work-life balance through the pandemic. Teachers are answering emails at 10 o'clock at night because we want to do what's best for our kids. We're worried about our kids. But that, of course, erodes our own mental health because we're never off. And I'm sure now that we're starting summer, a lot of you can relate to that. You need that mental health break more than ever. But things are possibly going to kick back up in the fall. Nobody knows what school is going to be like. We may be home, we may be remote teaching, it may be a hybrid model. And so we have to prepare for all of these different factors all over again. So now let me hear from you, because one of the things I know from working with teachers and from doing workshops all over the world is that the smartest person in the room is often the room itself. And so let me hear what you have to say. I want to know, how prepared do you feel teachers in your school and district are at being able to handle students' social emotional needs? And this can mean before the pandemic, of course, when we were in school, but also you know, right now in this remote teaching environment that we've had for the past couple of months. So you see the poll is now open. You've got 5 different choices, ranging from not at all prepared all the way to extremely prepared. I'm asking you this question because we've done the same survey. In addition to some of the things that Amanda shared with you, I am also the vice president of the Pennsylvania Teachers Advisory Committee. And we've polled teachers in Pennsylvania to find almost the same data. So I'm going to share what we found after you answered this poll, and we'll see how closely it matches. I'm guessing that it's probably going to match pretty closely. It did in our morning session, but we'll see how it comes out. So go ahead and take a second. And
yes, you can go ahead and you can go ahead and click right on your screen. And if you're not able to click on your screen, you can type in the question box. We'll just give you another minute. Looks like we have about 70% who have voted so far.
Awesome. Yeah. And don't forget, if you're done and you're waiting, go ahead and share in the chat box if you've got any ideas of great things that your district is doing to be able to facilitate this, to protect kids' social emotional health, or to help kids develop the kinds of relationships that they need to be able to to make sure that they're mentally healthy, go ahead and put that in the chat box. Or also, if there's really a deficiency that you see, don't get yourself in trouble by naming your district or calling people out. But if you have a general comment on things that we need to be doing better, go ahead and throw it in the chat too, and let's see what you have to say.
Okay, we can close the poll. Looks like we have about 80% who voted.
Yeah, perfect. So let's see what you said.
So 7% said they're not prepared at all. 33% said a little prepared. 47% said somewhat prepared. 4 answered 4. 11% answered 4 prepared, and 3% answered 5 extremely prepared.
Yeah, so this matches. Actually, you're doing a little better than the morning session. Morning session was about, I think, 8 or 9% total were prepared or extremely prepared. This group, you're at about 14%. So 14% of you feel like your teaching colleagues, like your colleagues at school, are either prepared or extremely prepared to handle the social emotional needs of your students. That's a scary number, but it's not. You're not all that far off from other teachers. It's not like you're an outlier there. This is what we found in Pennsylvania on the right. So we surveyed our members and teachers from around the state, rural, urban, and suburban, and 51% of teachers said that they are not prepared. 41.9% were not sure, probably because they weren't exactly sure what social emotional learning is. And many of you that just took the survey may feel the same way. So it's time for us to kind of dig in and talk about what it means. You can look at some other questions that we had in there that were somewhat related. Have you received training? How well do mental health agencies work with your school district? You can see that data there. But over on the left-hand side, you'll see the CASEL model. And CASEL has some amazing social emotional resources, as does Sanford. So Sanford Inspire, Sanford Harmony, they've got some great resources on SEL also. But I love this visual from CASEL because it shows the 5 different aspects that they talk about when they're talking about social emotional health. Self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And one of the things that I'd like to stress as we look at this model is that these 5 components can't be something that we do extra from the curriculum. It can't be something that we set aside a half hour a week that we're going to focus on social emotional health or social emotional learning. In order for this to really make a difference for kids, and in order for us to really make sure that they're mentally healthy and emotionally healthy, this needs to run across everything that we do in school. This needs to become a culture in our schools. And since there is such a push for STEM, and most of the impetus for STEM is based in that qualification we talked about before, right? There are going to be jobs that we need. Kids need to be qualified to be able to get into those jobs. So we need them to learn science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And that's all fine. But the SEL part is what balances the qualification, or with the qualification with the subjectification and the socialization. This is what helps our kids be holistically well. And so this needs to run across everything that we do in schools. And we're going to talk how to specifically do it in STEM. And of course, STEM doesn't have to be in science or engineering classes.
And Michael, we've had a few share in the chat box.
Yeah, so let's take a second and hear from them.
Yeah, we had some participants share they use Second Step, some use Harmony, some use Lego therapy. One participant comment, we do SEL activities as part of our morning announcements, as well as a student structured meeting once a week. Another participant shared, I work with pre-K to 2nd grade students and teachers nationwide. One of the biggest issues with engagement with our little ones is getting family buy-in. By developing learning experiences that have real purpose and that engage the whole family, many more students show up.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, that in order for us to really develop the culture that we talked about, it can't just be in school and it can't just be in our subject areas. It really needs to involve families, but also the community. It has to be a holistic approach. And anytime one of those pieces is not there or not fully participating, not fully developing that culture, students will fall through the cracks. And so those are really good points that we need to build bridges with families and with the community. Related to social emotional learning is trauma. And I put this slide in there, one, so you can see some of the data from Pennsylvania that we found, but also because right now our students have been traumatized. They've been traumatized by COVID for some of the reasons that we talked about before. Some of them are experiencing trauma more than normal because they're in homes that are not safe. Some of them have been traumatized by some of the current events that have happened recently, and some of the things they've seen on the news. If we have students of color, you can absolutely be sure that they have been impacted by some of the scenes that they've seen on TV lately. And so all of that trauma is going to affect how our kids learn. And trauma-informed practices are a part of social emotional learning. They're not synonymous, but it's something that we definitely need to be focused on, making sure that we can handle, identify, and help kids, through that trauma when they're in schools, because it's going to impact how they view our curriculum and also just how holistically well they are. So it's just part of our job as teachers. So all of these trends that we just talked about, the erosion of mental health, trauma, we didn't really mention it, but in the COVID slide, we could have talked, I'm sure all of you know that there has been great inequities that have been exposed through distance learning and remote teaching, because children that have access to technology are able to stay up on their studies and have relationships with their teachers and with their peers in a much different way than kids who are isolated without technology. All of these trends have been accentuated by the fourth industrial revolution. So that's a term that most teachers are not familiar with, so I'm just going to explain it briefly. If you look on the left, you'll see that graphic shows us the first, second, third, and fourth industrial revolutions. When I was exposed to the term industrial revolution, I often thought of steam power, mass production, factories, the first and second revolutions. When I was trained to be a teacher, I graduated from university in 1997 with my elementary education teaching degree. That was the first year, my senior year, that I was able to see pictures on the internet. Before that, it was just a monochrome screen where I could get the weather and send email. So that was the beginning of the World Wide Web. That was the start of the internet age. And that's where I was trained. I was trained to use technology in my classroom during the internet age. But we're now in a situation where artificial intelligence, biotechnology, the integration of technology into human beings, is causing ethical dilemmas, is creating all of those trends that you see on the right-hand side. CRISPR, I was just listening to a great podcast a couple days ago about the implications of CRISPR. If you don't know what that is, it's a technology where we can change the genes in cells, including in human embryos, in utero. So you could potentially change humans' genes to be able to do all kinds of things. It's actually been used twice already. Once to try and help twins become more resistant to HIV because their parents were HIV positive. I'm not saying whether that's ethically wrong or right. I'm not a medical ethicist. I just know that the world that we're educating our kids for is getting more and more complicated, and education needs to keep up. We need to prepare kids to live in a world where those kinds of ethical dilemmas are going to happen more and more. On the right-hand side, you see some of the trends that are happening. Increased inequality is absolutely one of them. As technology becomes more and more pervasive in our lives, it drives equity gaps wider and wider apart, unless we are intentional about closing them. So an example of this on a global level is in Pittsburgh, in my home state of Pennsylvania. If you call an Uber, a self-driving car may come and pick you up. I gave a keynote in Tricolo, Greece, where they had self-driving buses in their town, same thing. But 17% of the world still lives without electricity. And so that gap between the haves and have-nots is getting wider and wider. We can, the obvious example for us here in the United States is just look at what happened during COVID with education. The gap between technological haves and have-nots in educational access. So that is certainly an equity gap that's being widened by technology. So we need to be aware of these trends as we talk about STEM, because technology is such a large part of it. So let me hear from you again. I'm going to throw out a question to you, and let me give you the context first. So back in 2013, Johnson & Johnson, the pharmaceutical company, ran a study where they looked at the most successful people they could find. And they looked at all of the character traits that they have to try and determine which character trait correlates best with success. So I'd like you to guess what they found. What character trait do you think most successful people have? Or a better way to frame that might be, what character trait do the highest percentage of successful people have, according to that Johnson & Johnson 2013 study? So go ahead and put your answers in the chat box. Let's see what you have. Let's see some of your comments. And Amanda, go ahead and feel free to read out as they come in.
Yes, perseverance, open to the perspective of others, time management, self-worth, flexibility, empathy, determination, resilience, grit, growth mindset, empathy, consistency, listening skills, emotional intelligence, flexibility, critical thinkers, thinking outside the box, consistency, problem solving.
Yeah, great answers, and that falls right in line with what we heard this morning and what I've heard from most groups. Grit and determination tends to come up a lot. Definitely perseverance, time management, all of those show up pretty often. But the answer actually fits with exactly what the World Economic Forum and what the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a global data bank that looks at economic data, both of them have identified this character trait that I'm going to share with you in a second as being the most important for the job market in 2030 and beyond. So it is empathy, emotional intelligence. And so I can tell you that I have been teaching for 22 years. I've currently, this year I took a 1-year leave of absence to put together the book that I shared with you before, but I'm going back in my classroom next year. I'm really excited to see my students again. But in my 22 years of teaching, I have not had one professional development session or faculty meeting that was given to me by my district that focused on how we develop empathy and emotional intelligence in students. It is the most important thing that we teach, and we spend almost no time talking about how we can do it systemically. And so that needs to change in order for us to make sure that our students are emotionally well. So think about this for a second. And again, I want you to go ahead and throw your answers in the chat. We know that now we've just shared that empathy is extremely important, that it's one of the most important things that we teach. It's one of the most important things for our students' future success. But let's think on a more micro level. Let's just look at the past couple of months. Think about the events that have been in the news, COVID, the Black Lives Matter movement, the discussions we've been having about systemic racism, and how does teaching empathy, how does making sure that our kids are empathetic intersect with those current events? So what kind of answers do we have there?
Realize our experience is not the same as other experiences.
Yeah.
Understanding other points of view. Empathy is needed to understand other perspectives. People need to understand other perspectives, help shape relationships and understanding, bringing understanding of others' situations. It's critical if we are to overcome racism, being mindful of different perspectives, create students that are inclusive.
Yeah, and all of those are wonderful answers. I'm going to go beyond understanding, though, for a minute. I think all of that is true. You have to have empathy to be able to understand others. And the reason for that is that empathy is not just being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It's being able to understand how their lived experiences that you don't have, how their lived experiences impact how they interact with the world. And understanding them is a lot different than being able to, or not a lot different, but it's a lower level than being able to empathize with them, because empathizing is almost like a higher order thinking or a higher order level than understanding, because you see different connections. And in order for us to have our students really solve problems in the world and to look for solutions both while they're students and when they graduate, they have to get to that level. Because the problem with creating solutions without truly empathizing is that there's unintended consequences that are created. If we create solutions without fully understanding the problem, without fully understanding the experiences of everyone involved, we end up creating situations where we solve the wrong problem, or we solve one problem and create another. So this idea that technology is impacting school, that it's impacting our education system and impacting society, and what do we do about it? Let's look for real solutions here. This is the question that we dove into in Teaching in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which Amanda mentioned at the beginning of the call here. This book was put together by myself and 5 other Global Teacher Prize finalists. All of us are education practitioners. 5 of us are classroom teachers. 1 is a principal. But there's a lot of people talking about the impacts of technology on society and education who have no idea what it's like to be in a classroom. And we wanted to give a global perspective of what this looks like from inside the classroom. And you can see some of the quotes from people outside. But most importantly, this is what we found in the book. So the entire book is based on this one graph, that in order for us to find a future that is both prosperous and peaceful. We need to keep our schools technologically relevant. Of course, when kids come to school, they need to see technology. Otherwise, they're not going to think that it reflects the world outside, because we live in a technological world. But most importantly, we need to keep education rooted in the things that are most important: humanity, empathy, compassion, building relationships. And so all of the entire book is focused on how we find solutions in that way. But not all of our solutions can be technological. So I'm going to share a little video. This came out of France. It's just about not even 60 seconds long, but it shows how sometimes we need to look to analog solutions.
Emma. Huh? Emma. 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 Emma.
So sometimes we have to look beyond technology, both in education and outside. So in the book, we came up with, some of you may be familiar with the SAMR model of educational technology. And what SAMR says is that the best use of technology in schools is to allow for tasks that were previously impossible. And we thought that that was a great model for the third industrial revolution, but that we need more now that technology has advanced. And so we advocate for an updated and improved SAMR model, in which the best use of technology in schools is giving kids the opportunity to have experiences that weren't possible before, that allow them to impact their global and local communities in positive ways, that allow them to make the world a better place. STEM is an absolutely fantastic way to do that, but I do want to acknowledge that STEM, STEAM, STREAM, all of these acronyms basically mean the same thing, even if they're not interpreted the same way. I am a huge advocate for the arts. I think that the arts and creativity are critical. I believe in research and reading. I really think that problem solving is not subject specific, and that if we're going to develop problem solvers, we need them to use all of the resources that they're at their disposal, and we need them to be as creative as possible. And so we're using STEM in the title of this webinar right here, but STEAM, STREAM, all of those are certainly equally as valid. I'm not going to get into a debate over which one, which is the correct term. I really don't care. What I care about is what we do for our students in our classroom, and I want them to be empathetic problem solvers. And so that's what we're talking about here. So one thing that we should acknowledge is that it is impossible, really hard to change the world if you don't know much about the world. I teach in a rural town in northeastern Pennsylvania. There's only about 2,000 people in my town. We are predominantly white. It is not very diverse. And I have made it my mission to expose kids to other people, other cultures outside of our community, because the world is becoming more global, and I want them to understand those different perspectives. As a matter of fact, in the last 6 years, we have connected with 96 different countries, with scientists on the International Space Station, and with scientists in Antarctica that were studying penguins in live time, where my kids could interact and learn from all of those different people. The 5 Clue Challenge is a great way to do this. 5cluechallenge.com. So as I've traveled around the world, I have connected with other teachers and students. I've gotten a bunch of video submissions from other people where they share 5 clues about their location, or about an animal, or about a famous person in their area. The clues start very broad. So I'm in a town somewhere in the United States, and they get more and more specific. And what I have my students do, and other students around the world do the same thing, is after each clue, we have students pause the video and we teach them how to research. So with this question, should we be using Google Maps, or should we be using Google Image Search, or a search bar? When we search, what word should we be putting in there? So it's my way in my science classroom of teaching research skills while exposing kids to some different cultures around the world. Really easy way to get started. Of course, we want kids to think globally. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a great way to get involved in this. You can see there's 3 resources down the bottom that can get you started if you've never done this before. Basically, the United Nations back in 2015 came up with 17 goals that will allow us to create the kind of world that we want to live in 2030. When we're trying to help students find their passion and find how their passions intersect with making the world a better place, all of those passions fit in one of these 17 categories. And so by exposing kids to the SDGs, we allow them to see how powerful they are to make the world a better place. So teachsdgs.org is a community of about 30 to 35,000 teachers around the world who are using the SDGs in their classroom, sharing resources and best ideas. Started world's largest lesson. It has resources and activities that allow you to do just what we're showing on this slide, combine the engineering design process with the SDGs to make the world a better place. And SDG book that's down the bottom is a free download that was developed by 15 teachers around the world that have concrete soup to nuts lessons that you can put in place to expose SDGs and help them start using them in your classroom. Other ways to get involved in global learning and expose your kids to different cultures outside of your local community. I mentioned the 5 Clue Challenge, a virtual field trip in a second, but on that link that I gave you, .com/VFT, there's all kinds of different sites that will allow you to take virtual field trips with your students. I'll show you an example in a second. Is a game where your students and my students don't know, and they take turns at try and guess the other group's location, and then after, hey, in your area, what do you have for lunch? What are the sports you like to play? Allows your student, and then finally, the Take Action Global Projects, a nonprofit organization that is international, where a couple times a year, 3 or 4 times a year, they create massive global projects where your students can connect with others around the world. I know some of their projects have more than 100,000 students that participate from 190 countries to take action on the SDGs in some specific ways. So one of them is the Climate Action Project, where I know there was kids from all over the world sharing their ideas and research on what's going on with the climate and how they can make it better. So that's a great place to get started because those projects are built for you already. So let me give you an example of what a virtual field trip might look like. I really love this. This particular virtual field trip comes from South Africa. Sandkub is a seabird hospital. So I'm going to let Tammy, the education director, just share a little bit about what she does and what this might look like in your classroom.
Hi, Michael. This is Tammy calling you from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm really excited for our workshop, which is taking place Saturday. It's Saturday night for me, but it sounds like a cool Saturday night to get to meet all of you guys and tell you a little bit more about what I do. I'm here in home pen. You can see we've got quite a few penguins with us. In front of me here is Steve. Hello, Stevie. So Steve is one of our ambassador penguins, busy molting. Here comes Stubby. She's annoyed because she's not getting attention.
I don't care how old your kids are. I don't care what grade you teach. Meeting penguins live on camera is something that will get them excited. And the great thing about these virtual field trips is that the education directors, when you connect with them, will adapt the virtual field trip to whatever your curriculum is. So if you're teaching high school physics, you'll be able to have that conversation and adapt the field trip towards that. If you're teaching kindergarten, they'll be able to help you out with what you're teaching as well, in most cases. But this is a good time for, let me share this with you. So often when we are in our pre-service teacher classes or we're being taught how to teach, we're told that we should start with the curriculum and find cool ways to teach it. And I think that's wrong. My 22 years of experience in the classroom has shown me that that is backwards. We should start with the most amazing experience that we can find for students, the kind of experience that makes them want to beat down the doors of our classroom to get in. And once we've identified that, and once we've set that up, it is our job to embed the curriculum into that experience. Because what neuroscience tells us is that in order to transfer information from short-term to long-term memory, we need to have an emotional connection with what we're learning. And so creating that emotional connection is what allows our kids to learn long-term. Think about when we learned multiplication tables or long division. We learned long division in 4th grade, and then our 5th grade teacher wondered how come we never learned long division, so they taught it again. And then our 6th grade teacher wondered how come no one ever taught us long division, and they taught it again. It wasn't that we didn't learn it. We probably passed the quizzes or tests on it after the unit was over. But after 3 weeks, it was gone because we just didn't care. Creating those emotional connections And virtual field trips are a great way to create that. And when we talk about the design process, engineering design process is not just for engineers. This is how artists create great works of art. It's how musicians compose. It's how we solve basically any problem. It's not just for engineers. And so this can be used in a reading classroom. It can be used in a science classroom. But we go through the same process. We ask, what's the problem? We define it. We brainstorm. We put together a plan. And there's always things that can get better. We improve it, and we go through that process again. Really important to infuse into that design process, no matter what subject we're looking at. It's really important that we understand the lived experiences of those who we're trying to help. So in that first step, when we identify the problem, this is our time where we really need to empathize, to get to that level where we understand the people that that are impacted by that problem. What are their lived experiences? And that takes real effort for us as teachers, and it's going to be hard for your students, but it's something that gets better if we keep practicing it. So really focus on that in your classroom. Just like I mentioned when I found my why with us working with the kids in the Kibera slum, make sure you ask for something in return if you're trying to help another group of people. This is how we find that shared humanity. We're going to try and collect data because we want to evaluate whether or not we were successful. Make sure you look carefully at that data that you're collecting. What data is being collected? What's missing? What are the limitations of the data you're collecting? So often we rely on quantitative data, things that are numbers that fit easily into a spreadsheet. But that quantitative data doesn't tell the whole story. We really need to get down to the qualitative data where we're speaking with people and we're understanding their lived experience. And then finally, we always have to ask ourselves and our students, what are the unintended consequences of what we're doing? Are we creating new problems by the solution that we're putting into place? It's only through infusing that social emotional learning and that empathy into the design process that we can truly create solutions and help our students see the world in a way where they can create solutions that don't cause more problems and don't make those equity gaps get wider and wider. PBL is a fantastic pedagogical tool for doing this kind of work in your classroom. So it's important to understand that project-based learning does not necessarily mean doing projects. When I was in school, we would learn, we would have a unit, and then my teacher would assign me a project, and I would bring home the assignment, and my parents would create a diorama. Actually, they didn't, but some parents would create a diorama. My parents weren't those parents. And then whether or not your parents did a good job would determine whether you got an A. You didn't really learn anything extra. It wasn't project-based learning. It was just doing a project. In project-based learning, the project is assigned before the learning happens. In order to complete the project, students have to learn. And so it creates a whole nother level of autonomy and agency for our students that allows them to own the learning. And I'm going to give you some concrete examples of how you can get started doing this afterwards. Problem-based learning is a little bit different. So in project-based learning, we have a defined outcome. In problem-based learning, because there are many solutions to problems, we don't know what our kids are going to come up with. We're providing them a problem, or we're letting them identify a problem, and then they're developing a solution, and the learning is embedded in them finding that solution. So the climate action project that I mentioned before is a great way to look at this. We don't know what our kids' solutions are going to be, but we know they're going to find them, and we're going to give them the resources to be able to do it. This was my own personal progression through PBL, and it's what I've seen in a lot of teachers, so I'm going to share it with you. It often starts, your first entry into PBL is through project-based learning, where it's very teacher-directed. You choose the project, you choose the groups for students, you curate the learning materials for them, but they do the learning and they create the project. As you get more comfortable, you're going to start giving more autonomy and agency to your students. So maybe you let them choose their roles. Maybe you let them find the learning materials. And eventually you're going to move into the problem-based learning, where you're okay with there not being a defined product. You're okay for your students starting to solve real problems. And eventually what you're trying to do is create a culture of problem solving, where your kids see the learning that happens in the classroom as a tool to be able to make the world a better place. That's really what we're trying to get our kids to. And don't expect it to happen overnight. It takes work. You know, just for me personally, I can say it was 15 years before I got to that fourth step of doing this kind of work. So just keep at it. Have a growth mindset, and each year just try and get a little bit better and do a little bit, do new things for your students that are great. And eventually, we'll move in the right direction. So let me hear from you again. What I'd like to hear right now is during remote teaching, during COVID-19, what are tools and strategies that worked for you or your district or your colleagues that allowed you to build relationships, connections, and empathy among students? And while you're typing, I'm just going to share one story that came to us through Pennsylvania, through a group of teachers that I worked with. They were struggling because there was no internet access and very few devices in their district. And it was actually a elementary teacher, a primary teacher, kindergarten, first grade, somewhere in there. And what they started doing was mailing self-addressed stamped envelopes and letters to their students, so that their students could read a letter from their teacher and then be able to respond. So it allowed them to develop that relationship even without those technology tools. So Amanda, do we have any answers that have come in?
Yeah, we have a few answers starting to come in. They scheduled weekly class meetings, non-academic communications, calling students twice a week. We did a daily meeting, hearing about the wide variety of distant learning among districts, class meetings where students got to share, play whole group games and included some SEL picture books, Zoom, maybe Zoom. Lots of Google Meetups, time for kids to talk. They enjoyed the chat, morning meetings, interactive newsletters that allow me to share videos, ideas for projects and lessons, meeting with parents, calling parents and students. I use material that the family could find in their homes, Zoom lessons, late phone calls, mailed books and letters to students, giving students many options, scavenger hunts, lunch meetups, email with students, Google albums for students to share their activities, and then we took every Friday to share one project with our peers.
That's cool. Yeah, those are just great ideas. And this is what I love. This is what I love about working with teachers, is that they are so passionate about making sure that their kids are well, and finding new ways to connect with kids. I love it. And I just love hearing all of those different ways that all of you have done that. One thing that I want to mention while we're on this slide is that one of the dangers for us, one of the things that we assume that our experience is, we generalize our experience and assume that all others have the same experience. It's not something we do intentionally. It's just human nature, because we see things through our lens. And so as you're doing this kind of work, of course we know that on the classroom level, there are some students that don't have the same access to technology, right? So something like having a Zoom meetup with kids is great if everyone is there, but understand who's being left behind and what we need to do to make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. But also, as we're doing work going forward, we don't know what school is going to look like in the fall. We may end up in some kind of hybrid model or being teaching from home again, and teachers are going to be asked for solutions. When you're in those conversations, don't assume that your school district's experience is the same as all the other school districts around you. Understand that whether you are in a remote rural area, and under-resourced urban area, or whether you're in an affluent suburb, very much determines what students' experiences are. And as we start looking at policies from a broad perspective and interacting with each other on social media, really try and understand the perspectives of teachers that don't teach in the same environment, because that's how all of us grow, and that's how we find solutions for all kids. So I promised you some easy PBL projects to get started. Here are 3 great projects that will work even if we are remote teaching. I love the idea of a class newspaper, because it allows each kid's passion to come through. So if you have a kid that's an artist or a photographer or loves to write or is into sports, it gives each of them an opportunity to do that and put a class newspaper together. And then you as a teacher can rotate kids through different roles so that they get different skills. And that can of course be done online if you have the access, or you can find innovative ways to have kids mail in their articles, or whatever. You can do that in an analog kind of way as well. Community projects, I have cleanup projects, but this doesn't have to be cleanup. But having students better their community. You can do that still while social distancing. The example I shared this morning of something that my students came up with was they were looking at our local food pantry and realized that families that were using it were getting only packaged goods. And so they said, we want to find a solution where we can get some fresh fruits and vegetables to those families that are using the food pantry. And they actually started a school garden. And so as a science teacher, I was teaching photosynthesis and the carbon cycle and some other things through our school garden. But the result is that we had fresh fruits and vegetables that we could donate to the food pantry. So community projects are great. And then lastly, we are living through history right now. Our students' grandchildren are going to ask them, what was it like to live through this time, this COVID time? Have your kids put together a museum where they find an artifact that exemplifies what they're going through right now, and put together a virtual museum that can be that can kind of serve as a lasting reminder to future generations of what's going on right now for students who are living through this. So I have one more story that I'm going to share with you about my students. I love talking about my kids, and I miss them this year. Like I mentioned, I'm not in school this year, so talking about them gives me a little way to remember them. But I want to share how this all came together for them in a way. This was these pictures were taken the first week or two of me teaching science. So I was a 5th grade teacher for 16 years. I was a K-12 curriculum coach for 2 years, and then I stepped into a science classroom. And I happened to make that transition just as I was named a Global Teacher Prize finalist. And so I had this incredible imposter syndrome because I didn't know what I was doing as a science teacher. I was learning as I was going, but at the same time, other people were looking to me for solutions. But what I knew was how to connect kids outside of our community. And so we had this Skype call where we played Mystery Skype, Mystery Animal. I was working on animal classifications. And students in Kenya, in rural Western Kenya, up by the Ugandan border, chose an animal, and we chose an animal, and we tried to guess what the other animal was from the other class. But afterwards, the school director took me on a tour of his village, and he showed my students this bridge. The picture on the bottom is an actual picture from that Skype call. And what he explained is that kids in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade were not allowed to go to school if they lived on one side of that bridge. And that during the rainy season, which is what you see above, for the whole month of April, no students from one side of the village could go to school because the bridge was too dangerous. And my students instantly said some magic words to me. They said, "Mr. Soskil, we should do something about that." And this was one of those opportunities for me where I had to decide, am I going to push on with the curriculum that I'm unsure about, that I'm learning, or am I going to try and throw everything up in the air and try and let my kids pursue their passions and do what I said before, embed the curriculum into the things they're passionate about. And of course, I did the latter. I said, okay, let's see what we can do. And so my students used that design process that we talked about and had several calls with the school director and with students in that Kenyan village to learn from them. And they started by building model bridges out of paper, and they tested them with pennies to make them fill, and they made them better. And then they built them out of cardboard, and they tested them with rocks to make them fill, and they made them better. And finally, they drew up plans and they sent it to a bridge designer in Kenya. And the bridge designer told us it would cost $3,200 US to replace the bridge. But my students were determined, even though they knew that was really difficult to raise in our rural, economically challenged community. And so they had bake sales, and they invited the community in to watch movies because we had a license. They couldn't charge admission, but they sold popcorn, and they used our iPads to take pictures with a green screen. And for $1, they would send you an email of you in a really cool location of the picture they took. And over the course of the year, they were able to raise about $1,200, so well short of the goal. But halfway through the year, a couple of 5th graders came to me and asked if they could build a website. And they said, people outside of our community will be inspired by what we're trying to do, and they're going to want to help. So can we put this together? And through that website they built, we were able to bring in $2,500. So at the end of the school year, last week of school, I was able to show them these pictures. The picture on the right is students excited because they're going to be able to go to school as the bridge is being built. And the inset picture is the bridge that my students designed and built, along with some students that are now able to go to school. This is what's possible if we allow our students to use the learning that happens in school to make the world a better place. And I can tell you that for my students that come to school, a lot of them, because of the economic challenges and the home situation, they come to school lacking hope. When I showed them these pictures, every one of them knew how powerful they were. Every one of them knew how much they mattered. Every one of them knew when they came to school why they were learning, because it allowed them to do things like this. And I hope that that's a lesson that they'll never forget. I truly believe that every problem in the world has a solution that's locked inside the passions of our students, and that our job as teachers is to support our students and empower them and help them find the keys so they can impact their local and global community and make the world a better place. So thank you all for taking a little bit of time on your Tuesday to join me. I think we have a couple of minutes for some questions and answers before we go. So Amanda, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Michael. That was so inspirational. Just what we all needed today. Yes, a few questions have popped in. One question was, what was the website for the virtual field trips? Is there one website that you recommend?
Yeah, so actually there's a few websites that I recommend. You can find all of them. You see my website on the screen right now, michaelsoskil.com/VFT for virtual field trip. If you go to that, it has all of my favorite virtual field trip websites, and you can play around with each one of them, and all of them are amazing.
Great. Another question, a heavy question here. With so many universities only focusing on the democratic thought process, how do we help schools to get balanced educational systems where all thoughts and perspectives are valued?
Yeah, awesome question. There's a book coming out about that, about how we can transform education to make sure our democracy is healthy. I highly recommend it. But it's a really complex question that requires, I could do a whole webinar just on that. But what I will say is that we don't do a great job of having those discussions in school right now, because as teachers, we're afraid of the political fallout of doing that. And so when it comes to controversial topics, we tend to ignore them. And that is, I'm not putting the blame on any individual teacher. We all are in a system that doesn't promote our ability to be able to have those conversations. But we need to understand that there are no apolitical teachers. Everything we do in a classroom is political. Our choice of what paragraphs to read in a textbook, our choice of how we grade, our choices of what materials we use in our classroom, all of those have political ramifications because we operate within the body politic. We are creating future citizens. That's one of the purposes of public education. And so I do think that we need to allow and facilitate those conversations that are uncomfortable in class. And we could talk a lot about how we do that, but I think it starts there.
Great. And one more great question. How do you connect with teachers from around the world?
Yes. Oh, I love that question so much. So social media is your friend. Don't be afraid to use it. It is not just for politicians who are looking to share their thoughts. Every day, this is as of 2 years ago, every day, 4.2 million tweets on Twitter. Each day were about education. So if you are not tapped into that social media space, you are missing out on all of those great conversations that are happening around education. So you can start by curating your network on social media. Hashtags are a great way to do that. Facebook groups, but also one of the websites it's on the virtual field trip page that I shared before. But if you do a Google search for Skype in the classroom, it's Microsoft's site where you can find virtual field trips and connections for Mystery Skype. But in there's a map that you can zoom in on, and you can find teachers anywhere in the world that are willing to connect with your class. So if I was doing a full day workshop, one of the things that I do is I zoom in on Kazakhstan, because there are 6 teachers in Kazakhstan that are willing to have a video conference via Skype and connect your class with theirs. So that's a wonderful resource for doing that kind of thing.
Wow, thank you so much. Well, we don't have time to answer all your questions. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Michael. His contact information is here. I want to thank you all for participating today and taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn more about building empathy as your students solve real-world problems. Michael, do you have any final words for our audience?
I just want to thank all of you for giving up some of your precious time on a Tuesday. I know it has been a long and tumultuous school year, but the fact that you are here on a Tuesday afternoon, getting better for your students in the beginning of the summer says a lot about you, and I just really appreciate your time. And also a big thank you to Sanford Harmony and Sanford Inspire for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun, and I always love sharing the things I'm most passionate about with teachers and with kids, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. We're getting so many thank yous in the question and chat box. So thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and expertise. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us and letting you know this webinar is going to come to a close shortly, but we want you to come back and see us in August. We will take a break in July, but our educator webinar series will resume in August with a great presentation on tips for re-engaging with parents after school closures, presented by Dr. Mary Connage from the University of Florida, and you can sign up on our website today. Once this webinar comes to a close, a survey will launch on your screen. It's very short, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. We do read your feedback and take your responses seriously. To this day, your responses have helped us build more successful webinars. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe.